G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with the conclusion of the Minefield, and they've just got a guest.
She's in Adelaide this week. Hello, Karen.
Well, hello, and thanks for having me.
Oh, look, it's our tremendous pleasure. You've written quite remarkably, I think, on the use of emotions within the media. I'm not going to put, in fact, a question to you. You've heard Waleed and I argue ourselves, I think, around in circles. What do you make of this? Where do you want to go with this?
Well, I think that it was fascinating to listen to your conversation, but also it made me think that you were being very harsh on the media, because I think that in fact the media do all of the things that both of you would like them to do. So I did a book a few years back with my colleague Simon Cottle and Mary Panti called Disasters and the Media, where we studied how disasters are actually covered in the media. And what we found there was something very fascinating. What we found is that disaster coverage always and inevitably becomes about the political. But just like you go through different stages of grief when you're dealing with a personal trauma, in the same way, we see a kind of pattern where media coverage of disasters goes through different stages. And so in the initial stages, obviously, the emphasis is on getting information about what area is affected, how many people have died, how many people are missing, how many homes have been lost. And then it turns to this very emotional exploration of the grief of victims, really telling the stories of the people on the ground. But then ultimately, and this sometimes happens very quickly, as in the case of the Grenfell Towers fire, and sometimes much more slowly, it does turn to these larger political questions, questions that really explore this kind of tension, if you will, between man-made and natural disasters, questions about who's actually responsible for this. And so we always see this turn to the political. And what we found in our research is that actually by telling the stories of the victims of this disaster and by giving voice to the voiceless, you not only cultivate empathy and compassion for the victims, but you also actually give these victims a chance to raise these political questions. So in a sense, I would say that yes, if you just have emotional storytelling for the purpose of exploiting the victims' accounts, then it's obviously incredibly problematic. But what we see usually is that it's actually tied to these larger political questions. And one very interesting thing is that researchers who have looked at public perceptions of climate change, for example, have found that public concern about climate change is very closely linked to big events associated with climate change that are extensively reported in the media. So it also actually seems to have an impact on how the public sees these larger political issues.
So I find that fascinating because part of what you say is very familiar to me. I understand the notion of a cycle, and I do think you do get around to the political aspects of it. I know this because I've enacted it myself as a media practitioner. But I would say that those questions do seem to be raised right at the point where interest is beginning to wane, or at least that's the way it feels. So it's a bit like the paradox of covering a terrorist attack, where the most intense coverage is at the time where we know the least about it, and then as we begin to discover more about a particular plot or who was involved, the media circus has moved on and we're no longer paying attention, and that makes it hard for us to learn any lessons from what's happened previously or get a picture of the way that something like terrorism is evolving, unless you are someone who has a special interest in it. And I feel like, although the natural disaster thing is not exactly the same, there's something analogous that goes on. Yes, there is a process. Yes, we do eventually get round to issues. And yeah, it is probably true that public perceptions of a thing like climate change are affected by the prevalence of natural disasters. But I do feel like the conversations that we would have about it, the connection of climate change with the emotional, for example, doesn't readily happen. You don't see a scene of devastation and flooding and people crying on the streets and hear a reporter say, this is the face of climate change. You would not open a report that way. It would be seen as a crass thing to do. So by the time the conversation of climate change comes around, it's emotionally discharged. in a way that makes it a more abstract concept and a much more difficult one for us to handle politically because we're not invested in it in the way that we otherwise might be.
Well, I think that's right to some extent, and I think that what I found in my recent research that looks at Pulitzer Prize winning storytelling is that actually the way in which you explain these big abstract events, ranging from global warming to things like breakthroughs in DNA technology or the globalization of the fishing industry or what have you, the way that you actually sort of explain these and make these concrete is by telling emotional and personalized stories. So you're absolutely right there. I think that it's true to say that the one kind of big structural issue is not just sustaining public attention for the 2 weeks that where you have most intensive media coverage around an event like, let's say, Hurricane Harvey, but actually to create a longer conversation and sustain political action over the months and the years to come. And that's, I think, where it's much more difficult for media coverage to actually keep the focus on these events because of the fact that media coverage tends to be so event focused, so much focused on immediacy and on big breaking news events rather than these long drawn out and very abstract political processes.
And that actually picks up precisely where I wanted to take this. Can we move away from Hurricane Harvey for a moment? And I think there's an interesting connection between the flooding in Bangladesh and Grenfell Tower, which you raised before. I mean, one of the real paradoxes of Grenfell Tower is that the purpose of the cladding that was placed on the outside of this kind of famously brutalist stark concrete building, the purpose of the cladding was to render the residents invisible to the surrounding suburb. And it was only when it caught fire that the plight of those inside these vertical slums became apparent, became visible to those around. And this, I guess, really gets to me to the great, I guess, moral hypocrisy in many ways of the media. I'm not trying to ask the media to do more than it's capable of doing, but this determination, I think, to only pay attention to things, to make things visible only when there's the aberration, only when there's the spectacle, only when there is something that is aberrant to report.
When it's news.
When it's news. I mean, then what happens is that once the aberration passes, they become invisible. And that's the complaint of those in Bangladesh. The government only pays attention to us when it's calling this climate change and when we are flooding, but there's no development of the communities to be resistant against flooding in the meantime. So how do we, I mean, is there something that the media can
actually, but what's really interesting about that, Scott, is that that's where a concept is used to obscure.
Yes, it's
rather
true.
than to illuminate.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. So for me, I mean, this is fraught. How do we invest these bigger moral concepts with a compelling enough narrative that it helps people pay attention outside of those moments of the pure spectacle and the pure aberration?
Well, I think for me that is one of the key kind of fundamental structural questions around what the media are actually doing, because by their very nature, news organizations tend to pay attention to what the powerful and what the political elites are doing to the detriment of looking at the marginalized, those who have less privilege in society, and anyone who doesn't hold any power to actually influence public discourse. And so this is the really massive question that an organization like the BBC has been grappling with for decades, which is how do you actually adequately represent people from across the community, not just those who have the most power. And if anything, I think that the media have a greater responsibility to use this phrase that I used earlier, to give voice to the voiceless, to actually represent the views of those who otherwise tend to go unheard. And that is something where I think that there have been significant struggles, and it's an unresolved question. And I think you hear a lot of talk about how the emergence of social media and user-generated content might actually challenge that. But again, for me, there are still questions there around the sustained newsworthiness of the actions of the elite and the powerful.
Actually, Karen, that raises a lot of questions that we can pick up in the podcast element of the show, because there's so many conceptual threads there, I guess, to try to tie together. So hang around for that if you would. It would be wonderful too.
Yeah, well, anybody who's been paying attention to my channel will be fully aware that I haven't been observing any kind of social nicety effect when it comes to not commenting on the obvious connection between the increasing frequency and the increasing intensity of record-breaking extreme weather events, the connection between that phenomenon and the predictions of the last 150 years regarding anthropogenic global warming, as it were foretold within the prophecy. Global warming will utterly crush Trontal Dump's maladministration. That's what's going to happen. I don't see how he's going to convince anybody that it's a Chinese hoax that he's got 4 hurricanes blowing up his cloaca right now. They've shown video of him handing out relief supplies, putting a 5-gallon pack of water in through the driver's side window of a bloke who was driving a ute. I mean, the whole back of the ute was empty. He knows so little about the practicalities of carrying anything in a vehicle that he expected the fella to drive away with 20 litres of water bottles sitting on his lap. He told people to have a good time while they were recovering from the flood. 7 million people in Florida have run away from the second in the row of chain of 4 of these hurricanes, because they too have built their dream house on flat land beside the ocean. I said it in a comment on somebody's video. The bloke I feel sorry for is a fella called Kermit Weeks at a place called Fantasy of Flight. And Kermit's sort of like the archetypal poor little rich guy. You know, he inherited a gas and oil fortune when he was growing up in Utah. So I think he built his first aeroplane when he was 16, and then he decided he was rather partial to aerobatics, so he became the American champion and then took the American team to the world championships, and he sort of specially modified and specially designed his own aeroplanes, and he could just afford to throw shit pots full of money at it. Finally, when he got sick of winning at aerobatics on the global stage, he decided it might be rather nice to just go around and collect really rare, significant old aeroplanes and buy them and pay teams of aeroplane engineers to meticulously restore them. And there's one story about how he got an aeroplane ready to fly and he got sitting in the cockpit and he noticed that the electrical wiring that was in bundles of looms up and down the side of the cockpit, it had the lettering printed parallel to the length of the wiring, like they do these days. Whereas back in the 1940s, they used to print the lettering spirally around the wiring looms. And he's so concerned with accuracy or anally retentive, depending on your point of view, he made them pull all the wiring out of the aeroplane and find a manufacturer who would accept the contract to make new wiring with the letters printed spirally, and then make up all new wiring looms and then reconnect the whole bloody aeroplane, because he wanted it to look right when he was flying and exercising his Biggles fetish. Well, right beside a big puddle of water that's connected to the ocean in Florida, he's got this thing called Fantasy of Flight, and he's got 60 aeroplanes that, you know, the average cost would have to be between $1 and $3 million that he's sunk in them. And I think if he's going to get a 10-foot tidal surge and 185 mile an hour winds, I hope he's got them insured this year. Because generally I think he's so rich, he just provides his own insurance because he's that rich. It may be a case of the fossil fuel fortune giveth and global warming taketh away, I think. And that holds good for a lot of people who just didn't want to accept the fact that global warming is a happening thing. And it's actually our fault, you know, like it's not It's not happening because of volcanoes. You know, volcanoes have got to the point where a good volcano can ground enough airliners that it can be a carbon negative volcano, because although it blows carbon dioxide into the sky to put the ash in the air, it shuts down so many flights that they don't burn enough kerosene that you save more carbon dioxide by grounding the airliners. Anyway, we're into upload limit territory. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.